Welcome back, Honors. All right, just throwing this out there. Y'all are killing it right now, all right? Remember, you have your test on Friday coming up, okay? The study guide is already posted, like we talked about today in class. I would go ahead and start working on that just so you can start reviewing. This is a long unit. It seems kind of drawn out and stuff like that, so it's probably a good idea to go ahead and get started on it, right? And it is a little bit of a longer study guide, but if you need any help, I'm always here in the mornings, particularly in the mornings is when I like to work with y'all. S period I find to be a little on the distracting side for my honors girls, so definitely always here before school, all right? So, but we'll talk more about that and stuff like that during class. Let's get to where we left off in class. I'm hoping so anyway, because I'm making this before I've even seen you. Now, anyway, but the famine of 1315 to 1317. As we know, population was at an all-time high in Europe. They were cultivating all the land. People were walking around more. Trade was coming back. High Middle Ages. Why am I singing this? Blah, blah, blah. But all that stuff was great. But then one massive thing hits, a big climate shift, right? And then for about 300 years, Europe was in what was known as like a mini ice age, right? That we just recently actually have started to come out of. And the famine of 1315 to 1317 was almost directly caused by this massive climatological shift, right? So here's the issue. Now that you have all these big, now that you have trades coming back, urban centers are super populated, everybody's got a farm to feed everybody. No. If a climate shift of any type happens, you're talking about massive crop failures, right? Huge crop failures. So once that mini ice age came along, caused a crazy amount of rain, and a lot of the crops are going to be destroyed. And one consequence of this is this thing known as the famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by that mini ice age, right? As many as 15% of peasants in some English villages are going to die. And some of you are like, why are we just talking about England? They were good at recording this at the time, right? We don't really know a ton about the Italian centers and the Germanic centers because they're like a kind of a coalition of Germanic states and the Holy Roman Empire. But we do know also, though, aside from this famine and this starvation, it's creating yet another situation where Europe was like prime time for the Black Death, right? It was going to be absolutely terrible. It was going to smack them really hard, and it was going to wreck house, right? Because the consequence of starvation and poverty is increased susceptibility to disease. If you haven't eaten properly and you're not actually getting your proper intake of nutrients, it's going to be much easier for you to get sick. So we've got another reason between terrible sanitation, overcrowded cities, duty in the streets, just dead in the streets, people being too close together, and then famines and so Europe is like prime time number one. All right, so going into this though, let's talk about where the plague started. Let's talk about how it also got to Europe. So this slide is the bones of what you need to know. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story as well that you kind of need to remember on the flip side as well. All right, so the plague is going to start in China. All right, so now the plague we believe had its origins in China. Now, ironically enough, I don't know if y'all have heard about this, but we're going to talk about it today in class, but 2 days ago, 2 people in China were then diagnosed with the plague again. So it's still floating around out there. But the plague that actually hit during the 1300s is going to, we believe, begin in China, right? So now it's going to end up reaching Europe in 1347. Circle that number. It's very, very important. You got about 6 dates that are super important during this unit. I'll list them off real quick if you want to jot them off to the side just so you can make sure to study them. 476 AD, 842 AD, 476 is the fall of Rome, 842 is the Treaty of Verdun, 1066 is the Battle of Hastings, 1215 is the Magna Carta, 1453 is the fall of Constantinople, and 1347 is when the plague hits Europe. All right, so now the plague is going to hit around 1347 via a merchant ship on the island of Sicily. Well, speaking of merchant ships, you should also circle that word merchants, right? So they're going to be the occupation that's mainly responsible with spreading this terrible, disgusting, and awful disease, all right? So because these trade ships are going to start moving around, right? Now, these boats and these trade ships were home to rats, right? Rats want to be on these boats because they're carrying food items and precious items and cloths and different things that they might want to be a part of, use for nesting or eat, right? On these rats happens to be common fleas, a brown flea, right? and the fleas are the things that carry the disease. Well, the rats carry the disease. The fleas are what bite them, bite you, spread it, right? So originally, though, the plague actually ends up being used as a weapon at one point, right? So in 1347, we believe that a merchant ship traveled from a city called Kaffa, K-A-F-F-A, right? Right around the Crimean region, southern Russia, right? So we know that it started in China, and we believe that it's going to spread to the Mongols, right? Mongolians are not Chinese, all right? Mongols are from Mongolia. Chinese people are from China, right? Okay? Mongolia is not China. But the Mongols had successfully taken over a large swath of northern China, and then were pushing into Russia. Well, what happens to spread when you happen to start conquering a lot of stuff? The plague that probably originated in China then spread to the Mongolians, and while they were going and taking over Russia, it spread through that area as well. Now, we also believe that the Mongolians were pretty clever, and they would actually use the plague as a weapon, right? So they would actually take dead plague bodies or dead horses that had brown fleas that had plague in them, and they would launch them over city walls into other cities and use it as a weapon, right? Almost like biological warfare. Now, we believe that some of those bodies and horses were launched into this small city of Kaffa in southern Russia. We believe more than likely patient zero, or somebody infected with the plague, was running away from the Mongolians there, hopped on a boat, sailed to Sicily, and bang, the plague now finally hits Europe. And it spreads like crazy. From 1347 to 1348, in 1 year, it spreads from the island of Sicily to all of southern Europe, right? Hitting Spain, hitting Italy, hitting Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, and Austria, and it starts going. And then from 1349 to 1350, it spreads from Central Europe all the way to the British Isles, right? So as you can see, it is moving quick, right? By 1350, it ends up all the way in Scandinavia, okay? So the plague spread like crazy via those merchant ships, and also, like we said, because Europe was like prime time, good spot for the plague to spread, right? Now, some of y'all are immediately looking at this little region right here. You're like, why is that little one not actually, and like, why don't they have the plague? So that's Kiev and Rus, all right? Remember when we looked at the map of like 1050 AD Europe, and y'all are like, oh, Kiev and Rus, and I never really bothered to talk about them. They're kind of like the first Russians and Slavic peoples, right? Settled by probably more than like the Magyars and the Huns. Kiev and Rus built walls around their entire like settlement and their kingdoms, and they did not allow people to come in, right? So they basically held themselves away from the plague, which is actually kind of crazy. Now, but let's talk about the plague itself. Let's talk about the disease, right? Now, there are 3 types of plague. You're like, I thought you said it was Yersinia pestis. It was just that one bacteria. Well, we got to now talk about like the epidemiology of the plague. How it spreads, what it gets to you, what different types are there, right? So you got 3 big types, right? You got the bubonic plague, which comes from infected fleas, right, that bite you and then vomit the plague virus into your body. Due to the fact that fleas have a big issue with the plague themselves, they would go up and bite a rat, right? And then when they're sucking that rat's blood, they're bringing that bacteria into their mouth. Some of you are like, well, why isn't the rat dead? Rats can carry the plague but aren't really affected by it the same way humans are, right? So flea bites rat, sucks blood, right? Then that bacterium starts to grow in the flea's throat, right? Causing a blockage. And the flea starts to try and feed as much as it can because it thinks it's starving, right? Well, as fleas begin to think they're starving and this clot exists in their throat, they usually regurgitate to try and get all of it out so they can then take new blood. And then also, not to mention the fact that their saliva has a chemical in it that causes your blood to not clot while they're feeding on you, right? So this flea is just going to come onto you with this big blood clot in its throat and go, bleh, and it throws plague virus up into your body. Also, you can get it from rats directly, from scratches or bites from a rat, but you more often than not, like 90% of the time, will get bubonic plague from a rat. And that's about a 70% death rate, right? If you have the bubonic plague, you have about a 70% chance of dying. We believe that's the form that Justinian got when the plague broke out in Justinian's Byzantine era, right? So then you've got the pneumonic plague, right? Pneumonic plague is about being how it's spread person to person, right? So let's say hypothetically, I don't know, excuse me, who's going to have the plague? Who's going to have the plague? Who's going to have the plague? Let's say hypothetically that, I don't want to say one because she'll freak out and she'll be like, you always pick on me. So let's say Madeline Vogt has the plague, right? So Madeline Vogt's been infected with the plague. And something that happens when you get infected with the plague is that the bronchial tubes inside of your lungs begin to swell and try to fight off the plague as well. And what ends up giving you is a form of pneumonia. Pneumonia is when bacteria begins to grow in the fluid that's actually inside of your lungs, right? So there's a mixture of blood and fluid inside of someone's lungs when they have pneumonia. And when you cough, some of those things are expelled, right? Now remember, bacteria thrives and lives inside of blood. So if you have that stuff in your lungs and Madeline goes, ugh, she just shot plague virus out into the air in tiny little microscopic droplets, right? And if sitting nearby her is Kelly Rosales, and she just goes and inhales that plague virus, boom, now she's got pneumonic plague, right? So that's how you end up getting that. Now, the crazy part about this one is it's about an 80% death rate. And then you've got the septicemic form of the plague, which looks like this. Blah. All right, so the septicemic form is 100% mortality rate. It's following it's a result of the bubonic or the pneumonic plague, right? You get bubonic, you get pneumonic, you might survive. But if it gets bad enough, it turns into septicemic plague, right? Which actually causes necrotic flesh. It's where the Black Death gets its name. So septicemic plague is when your blood gets poisoned and it starts moving through your entire body. Your lymph nodes get infected and they turn into these things called bulbous because like pus and gunk starts to like collect there trying to fight off the infection. And then your extremities first start to turn black and fall off and rot like while you're still alive. And that's 100% mortality rate. And some of y'all are immediately saying to yourself like, how? Well, there's no way all that stuff comes out of my face whenever I cough. When we're talking about the pneumonic plague, this is where I'm going to go ahead and tell you you're a liar, because this is just the average sneeze. The average sneeze comes out of your face at about 60 miles an hour, and this is how much gunk comes out of your face when you're doing this. Cover your mouth. That's gross. All right, do it in your elbow, and just like that, which actually means our elbows are disgusting. But as you can see, the plague is nasty. All right, wait, come on back. Come on back now. Come on back. There we go. All right, so that is the septicemic form of the plague. But here's the big thing, too, is going to happen. Really quick, before you even start jotting this stuff down, right? None of these worked, all right? So I've had in the past a lot of students get confused about what we're about to talk about, all right? But during the plague, mass hysteria starts hitting, right? So people are freaking out. They're burning bodies in the street. They're thinking that God's punishing them. They're like, they don't know what's going on. They don't even know what bacteria is. They don't even know that are microscopic things that live on you. They're like, bah! And they're just freaking out, right? So, of course, hysterical cures for the plague are going to come up. Notice I have cures in quotes, right? So a lot of crazy stuff starts going down during the 14th century when the plague has hit Europe, right, in 1347. People begin to think that they can self-diagnose the plague, and they start coming up with popular medical cures, right? And some of y'all have experienced popularized medical cures for random stuff before. Y'all have heard like, oh, essential oils can like help me fight off disease. No, they don't. All right, so like, you know what helps you fight off disease? Good diet and strong like immune systems, right? That's why I never get sick. All right, so now, but popular medical gears are going to start coming up when like people start wandering around and you start seeing these plague doctors, right? So plague doctors would dress in these wild costumes that almost looked like a bird, right? Popularized in Beauty and the Beast, the live action version that's actually alluded to that Belle's mom dies of the plague, right, when the plague doctor shows up with a big old beak and everything. So why they had the big old beak, though, is because apparently they would shove herbs and spices down into the beak so they wouldn't smell the bodies of dead people, and they would wear big robes and hats and like sticks and stuff so they didn't have to touch the bodies and everything like that. So crazy thing about it is a lot of historians are beginning to argue the fact that like, oh, there was only like 3 accounted occurrences of these plague doctors ever even existing. Look, nerd alert, shut up, all right? If it only happened 3 times, it's still crazy that it even happened 3 times, right? So we do know that these things occurred, and we believe that plague doctors started kind of to roam around, and like they wore this crazy mask, and like their costumes in general are almost evident of the hysteria of the plague, right? I've always wanted to dress up like one of these for like Halloween. But also, other ones like bathing in human urine became a popular medical cure that did not work and actually spread the plague much worse. Wearing excrement, which is like it's like human waste. All right, so that became a popular medical cure, which also didn't work. Right, putting dead animals in your house, which made it worse. All right, so wearing leeches was a popular medical cure, which didn't work as well because leeches also tend to go bleh, and then also like to regurgitate plague virus into other people, right? So Huh? Like, so a lot. Well, ironically enough, the crazy part about it is leeches are actually used these days to actually use like clear up blood clots and stuff like that. All right. So anyway, but drinking molten gold, like drinking powdered emeralds, burning incense in your house to get rid of the smell of death. None of these things actually worked. All right. So like as you can tell, a lot of hysteria is going to be caused, right? And then, really quick though, before we go any further, let's talk about how the plague finally actually ends, right? So the plague does end up finally coming to a close when people in Europe start to kind of realize, well, first of all, a disease is always going to run its course. The chances of it killing an entire population of people is very slim. It only killed like just a small percentage of people in the Byzantine. Let me look that up actually real quick. How many died plague of Justinian? Now, also, we should preface this whole slide with the fact that struck and it's estimated 30 to 50 years. It says in paragraph that 50 million people, 8 years, 50 million European. Yeah, so the thing about the Justinian plague, it killed like in the numbers of like less than half of what the plague in Europe actually caused. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that they were just a little bit of intelligent and they practiced some of these things a little bit more equitably and a little bit more intelligently, right? So speaking of though, when it says how the plague ended, in parentheses underneath that, you should put like, but it didn't really. The plague kept coming back like over and over and over again throughout European history. It hit again in 1665 when Isaac Newton was alive. It hit again in the late Renaissance period when Shakespeare was alive. So it comes back in waves, right? But they finally ended the really bad Black Death in the Middle Ages by doing simple things like quarantine, which is isolating infected people away from the uninfected, right? Moving. A heavy amount of aristocrats and wealthy people are going to start moving out to rural areas for short times to get away from the plague. Isaac Newton apparently came up with his theories of gravitational force in the 1600s, almost 300 years over 300 years after this plague, when he had moved out of London to avoid the plague, right? So another one's like hygiene, right? Like actually learning to bathe yourself more often is going to be a way to actually end the plague. Cleaner air, right? Caused by burning fires in your home more often, because plague virus and bacteria, or plague bacteria, can actually only live inside of certain temperatures. And we believe that a pope might have actually been the one that discovered this, because he would always be anointing the sick. And how is it possible that the guy in charge of anointing the sick didn't get plague virus? We believe because he would always have two giant fires burning next to him. So if the plague virus was ever coughed into the air by someone with pneumonic plague, it would just burn up inside of the fires and not actually affect some of these religious leaders that were like sitting nearby fires and stuff like that. So cleaner air is another big one as well. Travel and migration is going to slow down as well. And also periods of peace. This actually happened during the 100 Years' War between France and England, but periods of peace are also going to bring around the end of the plague, right? Now, let's talk really quickly about the effects of the plague as well. And this is super important because you need to understand these things, but you're going to see a massive upsurge. This is kind of like 5 things. Leave like a space or 2 under each, and then we'll slip those things underneath there as we go. But this is like 5 little columns, right? So go upsurge of faith and religion, leave about 2 or 3 spaces. Economy, leave about 2 or 3 spaces. Culture, leave about 2 or 3 spaces. Got it? All right, so, but I'm going to go ahead and like keep moving so we don't take up too much of your time, right? So this is an example of an upsurge in faith in religion, right? So faith in religion is going to blow up because people are going to actually become much more devoutly religious during the plague, right? Believing that prayer and going to monks and monasteries and nuns in the convents and receiving their help is going to actually help prevent the plague, but it's also going to create some like crazy sects of the plague, right? So this is an example of one of those crazy religious sects of the plague, right? They were known as flagellants, or the practice itself was known as flagellenti, all right? So, and flagellenti is where these crazy monks used to like walk around Europe beating themselves as a form of penance, right? So instead of going to confession to be like, God forgive me for the things that I have committed, I'd like say some Hail Marys and have your soul like cleansed, they were actually beating their cleansing out of themselves, right? With whips, or they would hit each other, or they would self-inflict wounds and stuff like that, thinking that avoiding these, like doing these penance for these sins would actually avoid getting the plague, right? So, and now we're moving into like how culture was, so now we're moving in, this is the culture piece. Sorry, it's a little bit out of order. So culture was heavily influenced as well, because art is going to see a massive upsurge with the obsession of like death, right? Like, so for example, this right here, Danse Macabre, it becomes a very, very popular theme in a lot of artists and a lot of woodcuts and stuff like that, where like death and the dead would be seen dancing or escorting people to their final resting place, right? Or dead people or skeletons would be seen dancing or partying, as in the idea of more are coming to join them in this new afterlife, right? And then also, like, a lot of different crazy stuff's going to happen. This is another one that became very popular. This is a woodcut from the late Middle Ages as well, showing a doctor lancing a bulbous, right? Basically cutting into somebody's bulbous and spilling all the goop and stuff out of the inside, which actually also led to the spread of the plague. Now, this is the economy during the plague. Now, during the plague, of course, there was massively high unemployment, economic stagnation, and people lost a lot of money because everyone's dying, right? So, but ironically enough, the plague might have been the thing Europe needed in the long run to create a better economy after the fact. Because after the plague finally ended, and like the depression kind of finally ended from the plague, the European economy exploded, right? Like it blew up, mainly because there were less people, which meant less competition. That means a lot of these guilds and stuff are going to start being able to sell their items much easier, right? So less economic competition led to more money being made. More specialized crops from farmers. They began to start making cash crops like sugar canes and different types of other like oats and other like very, very money-making crops instead of focusing on grain to feed an entire town full of people because there's now less people, right? So more specialized jobs, artisans and craft workers are going to come back, and more money, since the money didn't go anywhere, but now that all these people have died, that means that all of that money has now gone into the pockets of fewer people, which means that more people have money person to person, right? So that's a huge thing as well. And this, of course, is how the population of the plague was, population was affected. So 25 to 30 million people in Europe died, which is close to 50% of the population of Europe done, right? So this is a low ball estimate. Some scholars believe so many as 50 million people died. The sad part is we don't really truly know. We do know it's in the high double digits of millions, but we'll never truly know because it's the late Middle Ages and no one's really writing stuff down. You know what I mean? So anyway, but we do also believe that 443 million people in the world probably died, which is close to 22% of the world population, right? Died from the plague. About 100 million like worldwide. 443 million people lived in the world at the time. And we believe that about 100 million people worldwide died, which is about 22% of the world population. Now, this is the last thing. The Black Death also is going to have massive effects on like anti-Semitism. Remember we were talking about like the Catholic Church's view in the Middle Ages of people of the Jewish faith, right? They were only allowed to do certain jobs. They had to live in neighborhoods alone. They were like isolated in these things called ghettos. And the death actually the Black Death caused like a massive persecution of the Jewish people because Jewish people lived separately from most of the people in Europe. They were only allowed to do certain jobs. They had very limited contact with anybody outside of their communities, so they naturally stayed safer from the plague. Also, their religion asks them to wash their hands and hair before they, at least once a week. It also says that they're supposed to do these things after they go into the restroom. It also says that you're supposed to cleanse a body before it's buried, right? So ironically enough, European anti-Semitism led to the Jewish people being more immune from the plague, but since they were more immune, they were then blamed for spreading the plague. They were accused of putting it in the wells of towns, and they were accused of actually being the ones that were responsible for it. And so a lot of anti-Semitism is going to kick up after the plague as well. So I know that was a lot of stuff, but it's a lot of really interesting stuff. I'm going to leave you off right there. I hope you guys have a great evening. I will see you tomorrow. I'll talk to y'all later.